Good morning and welcome to the San Francisco Interfaith Council online briefing for faith leaders. In today's program, we welcome the architect of the Stop Asian Hate Movement, San Francisco State University Professor of Asian American Studies, Dr. Russell Mark Jeung. The San Francisco Interfaith Council online briefings are supported by a grant from MetaFund. Thank you. The important and ongoing work of the San Francisco Interfaith Council would not be possible without generous funding from congregations, corporations, faith-based social service agencies, foundations, judicatories, and supporters like you. Help us spread the word. Visit sfinterfaithcouncil.org to learn about SFIC programming and how to become a supporter. Follow SFIC on Facebook, Twitter. Subscribe to SFIC's YouTube channel to watch all of our previous virtual events. A bit of housekeeping. Today's program is being recorded. For audio and video, all participants are muted and without video to minimize distraction. To submit a question or comment, select the chat button at the bottom of your screen and send a message to Q&A. Questions will be forwarded to the presenter for their review. To activate closed captions, select the live transcript button at the bottom of your screen and click Enable Live Transcription. Everyone, vaccinated and unvaccinated, still must mask on public transportation in healthcare settings, congregate settings, long-term care facilities, and recommended in K-12 schools and childcare settings. This also includes some city buildings. As of Friday, March 11th, San Francisco will not require proof of vaccination to enter restaurants, bars, gyms, and other settings where food and drink is consumed or elevated breathing occurs. Businesses can decide to be more restrictive and may require masks. The vaccines are safe and effective. Go to sf.gov to find a vaccine site or vaccine event in your neighborhood. Now is the time to come together, San Francisco, because together we can stop Asian discrimination, bias, hate, and violence. The COVID-19 virus has no race or nationality. It is simply a disease. To report a hate crime, call the SFPD at 415-553-1133. And at this time, I'd like to hand the floor over to the Executive Director of the San Francisco Interfaith Council, Michael Pappas. Michael, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Trey. Good morning. I'm Michael Pappas, and on behalf of the San Francisco Interfaith Council, I want to welcome you to this week's online briefing for faith leaders. This year's 140th anniversary observance of the Chinese Exclusion Act gives pause to reflect upon what progress, if any, our society has made to counter the tide of discrimination and hate toward our Asian sisters and brothers, both here and on the broader national stage. To offer a comprehensive and objective analysis, this week's online briefing for faith leaders, hosted by the San Francisco Interfaith Council, welcomes architect of the Stop Asian Hate Movement, San Francisco State University Professor of Asian American Studies, Dr. Russell Jeung. In addition to discussing his critical work, Dr. Jeung will offer a perspective from the lens of his own faith and what he perceives faith-based organizations can offer to build greater solidarity and inclusion with our city's Asian community. As we do at the beginning of each of these briefings, this week we'd like to welcome Colonel Deborah DeCumas, Commissioner of the San Francisco Veterans Affairs Commission and board member of the San Francisco Interfaith Council, to offer a brief welcome and reading of the San Francisco Interfaith Council statement.
Good morning. We welcome Dr. Russell Jeung and all attendees as we also remember the 8 persons, including the 6 Asian women killed in Atlanta, Georgia, a year ago. Before we start, I will read the San Francisco Interfaith Council statement. This is an interfaith community. Whatever our individual belief, it can be freely expressed here with no apologies. If we are invited to offer a prayer in this setting, it should be offered according to the tradition with which we identify. If we are invited to speak on a subject from the perspective of our tradition, we are free to do so without fear of offending those who come from another tradition. We come together as people of faith to learn from each other, that we might better understand the multiplicity of faith traditions in our city and in our world.
Thank you, Colonel DeCumas. It's always a pleasure to be together. At this time, I would like to invite the Reverend Canon Deborah Lowe Skinner, Canon to the Ordinary for the Episcopal Diocese of California, and also a board member of the San Francisco Interfaith Council, to offer the reflective moment.
Good morning. So much of what's going on in the world reminds us that we wish for a time when there is peace. And in fact, the term that my bishop, Mark Andrus, has always quoted is from the movement of beloved community, as he put in his book, Brothers in the Beloved Community, which he talked about the friendship of Martin Luther King and Thich Nhat Hanh. But I wanted to quote from the book, the quote from the late Congressman John Lewis, who said, "Democracy is not a state of being. You must do something. It is an act, and each generation must do its part to build what is called beloved community." Community of those who are committed to the vision of beloved community includes radiant beings who have come before us in history. And I now believe and know, this is my bishop quoting, I now believe and know that Jesus and Buddha, King and Rosa Parks, and countless others still at their work of compassion with us. Their contributions do not reside only in our memory, but as real now as many other acts. Christians call such beings saints and bodhisattvas. Among these saints who join us in our work of justice and the building of beloved community, there is a special power in the contribution of friends who undertake the work together. 5 years ago, when Dr. Jeung spoke to our executive council, that's our governing board of our Diocese of California, he was referring to his book, which was just released, which is At Home in Exile. And I wanted to quote a couple of things there. There were many gems there, also being an ABC, an American-born Chinese who grew up in Chinatown. And Dr. Jeung, I went to George Washington. I did not go to Lowell. And I went to the University of San Francisco, not San Francisco State. So I hope you'll forgive me that we're not from the same places. But at any rate, what I wanted to quote is the many gems that are in this book. He shared 1 year, the San Francisco Chronicle newspaper covered my wife Joan's work and life in East Oakland on its front page. And the first lines read, "In the past 3 years, 2 bullets shattered the front window. A teenager was shot just outside, and downstairs, the neighbor was mugged. Before that, a woman's lifeless body was unearthed from a trash bin less than a block away. But that part of East Oakland, where the neighborhoods of Fruitvale and San Antonio meet, where Dr. Joan Jeung has chosen to live with her husband and her 6-year-old son." Dr. Jeung continues, "A normal response, if one had the financial resources to do so, would be to move to a safer neighborhood. But just as we haven't moved out of our Oak Park and neighborhood and instead stayed to organize and improve its conditions, we chose to remain in our community and keep the murder dubs," as he calls it, because Oakland has one of the highest murder rates, to keep the murder dubs as our home. Joan and I feel that our call is to make our neighborhood a place of shalom. We don't want to secure just the health and well-being of our own nuclear family, but wanted to extend our notion of who our family includes. If our neighbors are part of our family, then we want our neighborhood to be better as well. And so he developed some practices in community. One of this practice is to employ as family, that he employed as a family, is to simply be part of a larger community, in this case, his church community, where many members of his home church, New Hope Covenant Church at the time, they all lived within a couple blocks. The second practice that he adopted for his family is to act as peacemakers in our community. His son Matthew and his friends, who were all in the neighborhood, are learning this lesson in concrete ways. Many kids in our neighborhood get bullied. In California, Asian American youth are the group most often bullied and racially harassed. Consequently, Matthew's school regularly conducts anti-bullying campaigns. He's learned the 3 steps to stop bullying. 1, ignore the bully. 2, if bullying occurs, ask the bully to stop. And 3, if bullying still persists, tell an adult. And Dr. Jeung goes on to say how his son has internalized that and practiced it even to this day, even when he was very, very young, to stand up to the bully and say, stop that, which I find really wonderful. In this time and with this the subject of stopping anti-Asian hate, let's even think of stopping hate everywhere, considering what's going on in Ukraine. And this being St. Patrick's feast day, I thought I would close with this excerpt from St. Patrick's breastplate. Now, the breastplate, or lorica, is actually what monks would say as a prayer of protection. So let me read from St. Patrick's lorica. Christ be with me, Christ within me, Christ behind me, Christ before me, Christ beside me, Christ to win me, Christ to comfort and restore me, Christ beneath me, Christ above me, Christ in quiet, Christ in danger, Christ in the hearts of all that love me, Christ in the mouth of friend and stranger. Praise to the Lord of my salvation. Salvation is of Christ the Lord. Amen.
Amen. Thank you so much, Reverend Lois Skinner, for setting the table today and giving us a foundation for the conversation which will come now. Dr. Jeung, it is truly a privilege to welcome you here today. It is your reputation precedes you. Everyone I've spoken to and I've told that you were coming here was absolutely thrilled. We know that Asian hate precedes the pandemic and has deep historical roots. But I have to say today, in addition to being St. Patrick's Day, is officially the 2-year anniversary of our own shelter in place. And I remember receiving a call from our colleagues over at Chinese for Affirmative Action, asking our council to sign on to a resolution that was being offered by the president of the Board of Supervisors, Norman Yee, back at that time, to just renounce the rhetoric coming out of Washington, D.C. with the past administration, placing blame for the pandemic on our Asian community. We did that in full solidarity with Chinese for Affirmative Action. And so these 2 years have been difficult for all of us, but I know that it has also been a time where you've given us strength, and your work at San Francisco has as well. And so we welcome you, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Michael. And I'd like to thank the Interfaith Council for inviting me today. Thank you, Reverend Lois Skinner, for your remarks. And I'm really grateful for this opportunity to speak to people of faith and to share my own faith perspective as I sort of reflect on the 2 years of the pandemic, the 1-year anniversary of the Atlanta shootings. They've been really traumatizing times the last 2 years for the Asian American community, the Pacific Islander community. And what I want to talk about today as I think about these anniversaries, it's again also the 140th anniversary of the Chinese Exclusion Act, is to think about we know how deep-rooted racism is. We know how traumatizing it is for individuals. We know how that trauma gets passed down intergenerationally. And for me, the question has been, how do we stop this cycle of violence? My real concern is as Asians get victimized by racism, hurt people. We learn to be racist ourselves. Asians who are victimized can become anti-white, can become anti-Black. And how do we stem this cycle of violence that has been going on for centuries in our nation? How do we stem the institutional causes of it? How do we stem and heal from the trauma? And so I'd like to share today some of what I think God's been teaching me about this process. And the talk is entitled, Be Like Water, a Faith Response to Stopping API Hate. And it's a response to not only stopping racism at its source, but also being healed and stopping racism that stems within. So as I sought my own sort of healing through the racial trauma, I've come across a Taoist cognitive therapy by Professor Doris Chang from NYU. And I think it really resonates, this type of approach with Asian Americans who are usually stigmatizing mental health. But I think this Taoist approach is really beneficial for everybody and is actually universal. And so from this approach of therapy, I'm going to call on all of us to take a Taoist Christian approach to dealing with racism. And that in this Taoist approach, Taoists believe that we can both heal individually and address racism on the institutional level, that it doesn't have to be an either or. And so we have to be like water, and water has 4 qualities that I want to talk about today. Water's clear, water's humble, water's persistent, and water is restorative. So the first quality of water is to be clear. And for me, that means to be mindful, to be aware, to be understand the impacts of racism, what's going on, so that we could get to the source of the problem. Water sinks to the roots of things, and that's what we need to do to uproot racism. So to give you a sense and to be clear and to have clarity on what's happening, I'd like to share with you all what we're receiving at Stop API Hate. And this is just a sample of some of the incidents that we've received from elders. So I'll invite Michael to read these and to give you a sense and to put yourself in the shoes of Asian Americans at this moment. Michael?
Can you share your screen?
Oh, you can't see it?
No.
I've been talking long without sharing.
Okay. Clear on what's happening. I was standing in an aisle at a hardware store when suddenly I was struck from behind. Video surveillance verifying the incident in which a white male using his bent elbow striking my upper back. Subsequently, verbal attacks occurred with, "Shut up, you monkey," "F you, Chinaman," "Go back to China," bringing that Chinese virus over here. Second, I was shopping and a child grabbed my arm. Child said I should go back to my country, and I was the reason his father died. Mother came up and put her hand on my arm, but she didn't try to help me. Bakersfield has ignorant people who make fun of how I talk and look and tell me to go home. But this is the scariest and saddest experience I've had in the US since about 1977. On my daily walk home, on my daily walk in my hometown, Sausalito, wearing a face mask, a white woman yelled at me, "I hate Chinese people. Why do they come to this country?" When she passed me, I was stunned by her words and caused me to fear and be more alert of my surroundings.
Thanks. So as you can see, and as you put yourself in these persons' shoes and empathize with them, you can feel the collective racial trauma that I think Asian Americans are experiencing the past 2 years. Clarity like water helps us understand the source of the racism. People really are blaming us for bringing COVID-19, and I think that's driving a lot of the racism. And as a result, they're going into flight or fight response and attacking us or shunning us. What's really sad is that children are learning the racism, children are perpetrating the bullying, and even more sadly, others aren't intervening. People are seemingly condoning the racism. Parents are perpetuating the racism because they don't stop and intervene. Consequently, as I said, Asian Americans are experiencing racial trauma. This woman is fearful and depressed, 2 hallmarks of trauma. And this person, who's actually a minister, is also fearful and also hypervigilant. So this is sort of the state that Asian Americans find themselves in. And to give you a bigger picture of what's happening and the trends, our latest national report shows that we've received at least almost 11,000 incidents of discrimination. This is just the tip of the iceberg. We did a national survey, and 1 out of 5 Asian Americans last year experienced direct racism. That's 4 million cases of hate. And they fall under 4 main categories. There are not all hate crimes like you see in the news. The news tends to focus on more violent crimes, but hate crimes only make up less than 10% of what's happening. And so hate crimes legislation and more policing won't really address the racism that we're experiencing overall. If you see on the bottom, about 11% make up civil rights violations, being mistreated at the workplace, getting denied service. Another category is online racism, making 9%. Our young people are especially cyberbullied. Our youth did a study and found that 70% of AAPI youth had seen something offensive or stereotypic in the last month. Microaggressions make up the bulk of the incidents. You could see 66%, 2/3 are harassment. And even though they're called microaggressions, they are really impactful in the effect on Asian Americans. We found that 1 out of 5 Asian Americans who experience racism display signs of racial trauma. That's 3 or more long-term symptoms of issues like anxiety, depression, fear, and hypervigilance, like the incidents discussed. And finally, the last category are cases of physical assault or being coughed and spat upon. And people often ask, how do you know racism has really risen? And I say in 2019, people were spitting on their fellow human beings. But 8% of our cases are people just dehumanizing and abasing their neighbors by spitting on them. In San Francisco, again and again, elders are getting spat upon. My own wife was running in Oakland. Someone just blocked her path and coughed into her face. Again, physical assaults make 1 out of 6 of our cases. We're getting pushed and shoved, having bottles and rocks thrown at us. People try to run us over with their cars. And so I saw so much vitriol directed towards Asians in our incidents. I actually wasn't surprised last year to see elders killed. I actually wasn't surprised by the Atlanta shootings because I've seen and witnessed the extent of the hate directed towards us. The trends have been really consistent. It's a clear case of racial profiling. 57% of our respondents are non-Chinese, even though China is blamed for COVID. they're mostly other Asians who look East Asian, Filipinos, Vietnamese, Koreans. But a Latino person in LA was attacked and told to go back to China. An indigenous person in Vancouver was punched and told to go back to China. Bullies attack whom they think they can bully, so women report twice as much as men, and elders and young people are also targeted. So if we want to be clear on what's happening, then you have to get at the roots of the racism and ask, why is this surge of racism going on now? Why are people targeting Asians for a disease that doesn't discriminate? Oh, this isn't the right one. Let me change slides here. Sorry. So there are three main reasons why the racism has really surged. And it was exactly 2 years ago when President Trump began using the term Chinese virus at the start of the pandemic, when the shutdown began. And that term, Chinese virus, really was deadly because what it did is it took a biological virus and racialized it and made the virus Chinese. And it stigmatized the people so that Chinese people were the disease carriers. That association that the virus is Chinese and Chinese people have the virus really became part of people's racial schema, their implicit bias by which they viewed the disease and by which they treated the people. That association that the virus is Chinese and Chinese people have the virus was really reinforced by media representations. And so time and time again, when people first heard news about COVID-19, it was often depicted with Chinese people wearing masks. And so again, that connection, that linkage was made. So here are some viral posts. This was actually a coronavirus party in a university. Students were drinking Corona beer and partying with pictures of Chinese people with masks on. And some of the people the pictures had their eyes X'd out as if they had died. But this is how university students are partying. And this is another viral post of the source of the disease, supposedly a Chinese person eating a bat. So again, when people hear the term Chinese virus, that term went viral and led to hate violence. When people see that representation over and over again, people then make that automatic assumption that the virus is Chinese and Chinese people have the virus. And then because they're afraid of the virus, they go into fight or fight response. This fear of Asians, this fear of disease, harkens and invokes the third primary source, the yellow peril stereotype. And this is a long-standing fear that gets invoked time and time again by politicians. And the yellow peril is the idea that Asians would come from the East and overthrow the West with their hordes of people and with their disease-ridden bodies. And so that's what's happening today with COVID-19. People are blaming Asians and telling us to go back home because we're invading and infecting this country. We're destroying its purity and its health. So to give you a couple of historical cases, you could see here in this photo of the Wasp, a popular magazine in San Francisco in the 19th century, the diseases of malaria, smallpox, and leprosy are specters of death coming out of San Francisco Chinatown. So because people thought that diseases came from Chinatown, because they thought that Chinese stole white workers' jobs, because popular representations were that Chinese were unassimilable pagans, we were heathen Chinese, these reasons became the basis for the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, the first act that actually barred an entire group. Even though Congress passed the Exclusion Act in 1882, that didn't quell the violence. It actually legitimated violence against Chinese. And really few people know that in the 19th century, over 200 Chinese settlements were actually driven out by white mob violence. 200 communities were actually dispossessed and expelled through violence. My own family, my great-great-grandparents settled in Monterey in 1868, right across from the Monterey Aquarium. And they lived there for 4 decades, but because of racism, the townspeople wanted them out. The landlord evicted them. And when Chinese didn't leave, a fire burned down the entire village. So the landlord then bulldozed the village into the ocean and fenced off the area so Chinese couldn't return. That entire village of 200 people was decimated. And so my great-grandparents had to move to San Francisco Chinatown as the only place of refuge. History repeated itself again in the 1900s, when the bubonic plague was found in Chinatown. Health officials segregated the area, quarantined the area. They allowed whites out, but they kept Chinese in with ropes and barbed wire and armed guards. So you see the Chronicle has the headline, "The bubonic plague has eerie parallels to today. A disease comes, Asians are blamed, Asians face violence, and Asians face racist policies." And that's been the pattern that we see repeating. That pattern continued on Angel Island. Again, Chinese were seen as being disease-ridden, so they had to go through severe health checks. For women, it was even more humiliating and shameful to be stripped naked and checked on by white male doctors. Again, also because Chinese were stereotyped as being illegal aliens, they were detained, mass detained for weeks on end. On Ellis Island, migrants were processed in 2 to 3 hours and allowed to disembark. Chinese, on the other hand, again, were mass detained for long periods, and 5% were deported back for arbitrary health reasons like hookworms. This connection of health, race, and policy continued with the disease of tuberculosis. And because of environmental racism, TB was an epidemic in California, and the Latinx community and the Asian community were harder hit. Actually, both sides of my family, my mom's side and my dad's side, got tuberculosis and had to be quarantined in public health hospitals. So this is one in LA. Again, because of health policy, parents were separated from children. And so again, my mom had long-term family separation because of TB. So you could see just from this quick history, the connection between race, health, and policy. My own family has experienced exclusion, detention, segregation, mass dispossession, deportation, and long-term family separation just because we were Chinese. Not because we're particularly sick, but simply because we're Chinese. And today, people are experiencing the same collective racial treatment. So, knowing that the racism is pervasive, knowing that there are systemic institutional reasons for the racism, the political rhetoric, the media representations, the long-standing stereotypes, I think our response as individuals isn't to vilify the other. And I think that's a tendency, the call for more police, to call for more punishment, to blame people for being racist. But if we're like water and if we're humble, we'll recognize that all of us hold these implicit biases. All of us are racist in our own ways. So we need to be like water that's humble. And water is humble in that it yields, it goes with the flow. It doesn't seek to fight through its own, for its own way. This is a nonviolent response to racism that I think we need to adopt. Rather than fighting back and pushing back so strenuously, we need to be humble and recognize the institutional factors that cause racism, that socialize people to be racist, rather than blaming individuals and perpetuating a cycle of violence. The racism has had systemic impacts. Again, for Asian Americans, our mental health is among the worst of any racial group. And those of us who experience racism have even higher rates of depression and anxiety. Economically, racism has really impacted us. Because people were avoiding Asian businesses, Chinese restaurants, Vietnamese nail salon, those businesses shut down earlier and had to lay off large portions of the Asian American working class. So 83% of Asian Americans with a high school degree or less had to file for unemployment. That's 2.5 times others with similar backgrounds. So you could see how hard hit we as a community have been economically. And again, politically, we've been treated as the yellow peril and faced with discriminatory treatment. During the Trump administration, the president banned Chinese scientists and researchers. He extended the Muslim ban. He then suspended migration visas altogether so families couldn't reunite. He cut refugee resettlement. He cut H-1B visas. All of these policies excluded Asians disproportionately, impacted us more, and treated us as the yellow peril. Again, we were outside threats to be excluded, dangers to this nation's national security or public health. So I'm arguing that if we were like water, we're clear on what's happening, but we're humble and we don't fight back against individuals, but instead seek to change the institutions that create racist individuals. And so we need to be like water that's persistent. And I like this notion of water being persistent. Even though water is soft and yielding, over time, it can erode rocks. Water in the ocean can create waves of change and become an even greater force. And so what we need to do is to be like water that's persistent in making change and pursuing righteousness. And that's what I see our community doing at the moment. Across the nation, Asian Americans, because of the racism, because of the trauma, have been really acting like water and being persistent for change. Our youth are standing up. We created a youth campaign 2 years ago and got 100 youth right away within a week. They did a national report on how racism is impacting young people. And they actually got Superintendent of School Tony Thurmond to write a letter to every school district in California to address racial bullying. This group of middle schoolers in Berkeley organized a 1,200 person rally, and they've been fighting for ethnic studies ever since. Other people who've been persistent have been our influencers. Before media and government paid attention, Asian American leaders used social media to sound the alarm. And because they were persistent, they were able to get the attention of these decision makers. And we've been persistent in coming together and working with our allies to make change. Again, after Atlanta, people have come together to find solace in one another, to grieve together. In rallies across the nation, Asians have come together with their allies to find support and strength. We've come together to support Chinatowns who are depressed, whose businesses are depressed, and we've created efforts to chaperone our elders and to protect them. And so I've been really heartened by this persistent desire for righteousness, this persistence to do what's right in our community. And finally, water is restorative. This is a photograph of Death Valley. And after atmospheric rivers, there's oftentimes super blooms that can actually be seen from space. And that's how restorative water is. It could take a desolate, dry place and create new beauty. And I think that's what we need to do coming out of the pandemic. We need, instead of vilifying perpetrators, calling for more hate crime legislation, we need to be reconcilers. We need to be peacemakers. We need to actually affect social change in ways that are restorative. And so we at Stop AAPI Hate have been calling for restorative justice. And I think I've really seen a movement to do so. We at Stop API Hate, with this restorative justice approach, have three initiatives where we're trying to get at the roots of racism and again, change things institutionally to affect long-term reform. One push we're calling for is educational equity and ethnic studies, Asian American curriculum in the schools. And across the nation, I think we've been able to spur this movement. In Illinois and New Jersey, they passed requirements, and 12 other states are now considering legislation to require Asian American history in the curriculum. This is pretty remarkable because at the same time, an anti-critical race theory movement is actually calling for the removal of discussions of race. So these two movements, one for ethnic studies and one against critical race theory, are sort of colliding as we consider what should be taught in our classrooms. We're calling for expanded civil rights. We think this issue of anti-Asian violence isn't necessarily a hate crime issue, but it's really a civil rights issue. And we're calling for a continuation building on the legacy of the 1960s Civil Rights Act. Currently in California, Stop API Hate is sponsoring 3 bills, and this is how congregations could come alongside and support us. These 3 bills don't look at racism as a hate crime issue, but as a public health issue. We recognize that racism harms everybody. It's deleterious to both our mental health and our actual physical health. And so we're calling on our legislators to pass a bill to make street harassment a public health issue, to define it, and instead of punishing people by putting it in the penal code and by putting it into the health code, we're calling on the health department to do educational campaigns to alert people to the harms of street harassment. We're working with women of color assembly members to demonstrate racial solidarity and show that the street harassment that Asian American women are facing, that our elders are facing, is an issue disproportionately affecting women of color, and we need to come together to address this type of harassment. We also recognize that 8% of our cases include harassment on public transit like Muni and BART, and often in large retail stores. So our 3 bills try to expand protections of our civil rights in these places. And finally, we're trying to push for community safety efforts that are non-carceral, non-policing, and we have been able to get an API equity budget bill passed already in California. It approved $156 million to combat anti-Asian hate. So in these ways, I think we could address racism without vilifying others, without creating more others, but recognizing that we're all in this effort together, that we all need to be like water, to be clear on what's happening, to be humble towards each other, to recognize that we're all complicit in the system of racism. And instead, we need to actually be persistent in fighting for righteousness, in fighting for peace, so that we can be restorative. So thank you, San Francisco Interfaith Council, for inviting me. I invite you to also be like water, to get your congregations to seek justice in ways that bring people together, that don't create others, but instead reimagine how we can be in the future. Thanks a lot.
Dr. Jeung, thank you. And your metaphor of water is a powerful one. And I think I remember back from my days in anatomy and chemistry that the human body is constituted by up to 77% water. So it is innate in us to be like water and to do good. But we are very blessed to have with us here today Reverend Norman Fong, who is a parish associate at the Presbyterian Church in Chinatown, a member of the board of the San Francisco Interfaith Council, and the former executive director of the Chinese Community Development Corporation. Reverend Fong is our ambassador to Chinatown and a dear friend and colleague. And we've invited Reverend Fong to enter into a conversation for for the next 10 to 15 minutes with Dr. Jeung to lift up issues germane to our local community. Reverend Fong, welcome.
I'm honored to be here and so honored that Dr. Russell Jeung is here in our midst. I love your creative theme for today, Be Like Water, because it also reminds us of Bruce Lee, who is my Chinese name, Little Dragon. You were so comprehensive and you covered all the questions that I was going to raise with you. So instead, I want to get a little deeper. Number one, I guess part of the problem of racism, right? Institutionalized, the old yellow peril, it's for real in ways that our faith-based community doesn't know. And so one question I had is, since a lot of the rhetoric that Trump used was supported by the right-wing church movement, how can we as SFIC and our churches, what should we be doing to counter that?
And I think, again, for me, one of the roots of racism is Christian nationalism.
Yeah.
And this is a notion, it's not necessarily what evangelicalism espouses, or even necessarily what white evangelicals espouse. It's actually a proportion of people who believe in Christian nationalism is the idea that America should be a white Christian nation, and that its roots are Christian and it belongs to white people. And that is really problematic for Asian Americans because a lot of us are not white and a lot of us are not Christian. And so because we're not white Christians, we're perpetual foreigners to be excluded. That's the yellow peril notion. And unfortunately, a lot of politics, or the church has really gotten involved in partisan politics. And I think that's one of the primary drivers of why people have been leaving the church. And unfortunately, because of white Christian nationalism, that sort of political perspective has led to a lot of exclusionary policies, a lot of blaming the foreigner, a lot of the xenophobia. It really correlates. Those who espouse white Christian nationalism are for building the wall, are for mass incarceration, are for using the term Chinese virus. So there's a strong sociological group of people. And so what I think the San Francisco Interfaith Council and its members could do is to really challenge this notion that our nation is for a few, but rather reimagine who belongs to America, who should be invited to America, who's welcome to America. It's the opposite of xenophobia. Fear of the foreigner is xenophilia, which is, Michael, I don't know, is hospitality, right? And so I think if we practice and values of hospitality, that really counters the yellow peril fears, this xenophobic approach to vilify the other. And so the more we could preach hospitality and peace, I think that would go a long way in providing the moral imagination that America needs. It's easy to go into fight or flight response and to vilify outsiders, but what we need is a moral imagination to include everybody.
And no one can argue with be like water. That's beautiful. But some young folks are saying to us church leaders, old school, we should be like fire. We need the fiery side of, like when Jesus flipped the tables of the, people making money off it. And I've been a little bit fiery in my 4 decades. And part of it is I keep discovering institutional racism. So I'm celebrating my youth program of 30 years, Adopt an Alleyway Youth. But 30 years ago, I found out that the reason why, and we were blaming ourselves, as we always do, that Chinatown was dirty and filthy was the city. We were the only neighborhood, this is 1990s, excluded from city cleaning. And so we had to fight and learn the system. I hired a planner just to change to include Chinatown, that other neighborhoods get their alleyways cleaned. We didn't. So, okay, be like fire a little bit.
Yeah, exactly. I think for me, and just personally, there's a lot of anger and there's a lot of rage at the system, right? There's a lot of sense of brokenness over the system. So both that anger and that grief can lead to despondency, can lead to burnout. And that's what I see a lot with young activists is they have a lot of righteous anger, and that's really valid. But then they fight against the system, but then they burn themselves out. And that's why I'm really preaching be like water that's persistent. You got to think of for the long haul. And so, sure, rally against the institutions that are so broken, but you have to be persistent over the long haul. And for me, that means translating your anger and grief into motivations of love and joy and being driven by those emotions as well. So bringing your whole self, your anger and your grief, as well as your faith and your hope and your love, enables you to persist and sustain for the long haul rather than just going out of fire, right? Fire gets extinguished, water keeps on going. And so, so I don't know. As I get older, I guess I have a smaller fire and and more drips of water. But I've always thought about myself, of my own anger and trauma, is that you got to translate it somehow, or else it eats you up or it burns you out. And I think that's sort of God's work, to take these really valid emotions, but to turn them to something good.
Beautiful. I don't know how long I get, but what's the impact of like San Francisco saying I'm sorry, San Jose saying I'm sorry, and why was Stop Asian Hate, the movement, so recognized? You're a Time magazine influencer now, and the overall movement. Put it in context of today. Why now? All of a sudden, sorry, we screwed 200 Chinatowns. Sorry, Go ahead.
Yeah. So what Norm is talking about is we helped build this Stop API Hate movement, and it's not just Chinese for Affirmative Action and San Francisco State. It's really a broad movement, and that's what I'm really proud of. It's not us as individuals or as organizations even, but it's a movement that's really global now, people of all walks of life standing up to face the racism. And so I think a lot of media outlets are recognizing how broad this movement and recognizing it. One thing, and as a result, because we've been able to build a movement, and because so many people are saying, what I was going to say, a lot of the reason why the movement is so large is because we've seen our elders attacked, right? Yeah. If it just happened to me individually, I would just brush it off. It's like, you would dismiss it, right? But when we see our elders attacked, they're the most respected members of our community. We know how wrong it is to attack an elder. So that's leading to a lot of anger. That's leading to a lot of fear. And that's what's driving the movement. I think that's, again, valid, this anger and fear, not at ourselves being attacked, but are seeing our elder family members being attacked. And I think that's why it's grown so large. And so we've created a movement, and so government has been responding, and cities like San Jose, Antioch, and San Francisco are making apologies. Pacific Grove is going to make apology to my great-grandparents' Chinese fishing village in a couple of weeks. Right. And I think these apologies are necessary because it's governments acknowledging the truth that they were wrong. And the more people can see they're public institutions admitting wrongs and pursuing what's right. That's what we need. We need a moral statement of what's right and wrong for our society, that discrimination and hate are wrong. It's so basic to me. And we should regret it, and we should seek to move forward with what's peaceable and right and true. And so for me, acknowledgement of wrongs is a scriptural approach to dealing with our behaviors, and it signals to the broader society what we really value. And so I think these public apologies are important. I think reparations for African Americans is important, right? It's unless we deal with the past, at least if we deal with it in the schools, then our young people get socialized into knowing what we value and what we don't value. Being colorblind, being anti-critical race theory, those approaches, I think, would just allow societal ills to continue. If we don't deal with them, these societal brokenness, these patterns of racism and sexism, then they'll go unchanged. And so we need to confront them. We need to apologize them. We need to regret what we've done in order to make changes.
One more question, Reverend Fong.
Okay, one more. Let's see. What's the future of Stop Asian Hate? How will it be more inclusive of other BIPOC communities?
Oh, great question. Thanks, Norm. Thanks for So Stop API Hate really wants to build a multiracial movement. So the issues we're working on, educational equity, expanding civil rights, fighting for community resiliency, are all opportunities to build a movement across race, right? So I think working for ethnic studies, we could work with Black, Latino, Indigenous communities to include their histories into the curriculum. And again, in our civil rights legislation, our bills are authored by Black and Latina assemblywomen. Fighting for community safety, everybody wants to protect elders, right? And so I think the issues we're working on are really opportunities, good movements, good issues where we could build a cross-racial group for education, for civil rights, for safety that I think everybody is for. And so we're going to pursue those goals, again, to be restorative rather than to work out of our own self-interest.
A thousand thanks, Dr. Jeung, for your participation, your presentation. The recording link, I'm sure, is going to be a great resource to our constituencies. We are very grateful for your presence here, Reverend Fong, Colonel DeCumas, Reverend Deborah Lowe Skinner. Thank you for your participation. And to Cynthia Zambucas and Trey Russell Allen, who helped to produce this program, we are grateful. I will tell you, this is the 73rd of our briefings over the last couple of years, and our network of relationships has grown. And I want to say a very special thank you to Dr. Jeung for something, because over 30 years ago, 32 years ago in particular, he was an intern under Mayor Art Agnos, and was very responsible for putting together the first interfaith winter shelter, which is now in its 32nd year and has been housing up to over 100 folks without shelter or food in that period of time. We thank you for your participation there as well, and for being a part of our history. This concludes today's program. We do invite you back on the 31st of March, when we are going to be joined by U.S. Department of Homeland Security State Coordinator Mario Garcia for a special briefing on cybersecurity in the United States in light of Russia's recent invasion of Ukraine. There are threats regarding our own cyber safety here in the United States, and so that should be a very enlightening program, and we invite you to join us on March 31st at 8:30 a.m. It's a long month this month. So again, that concludes this program. God bless you and God keep you, and thank you for joining us.